If you are just starting on your magical journey, a bit like our Fool cards here that I've got on the table, if you're just starting out and you're wondering which direction to take, maybe you're not too sure, and maybe you're worried about mistakes that you might make as you're starting out, then in this video I wanted to go through some of the common beginner mistakes that I think people make, certainly that I made when I was first starting out in practicing magic. And I hope that you will find these tips helpful, getting you to think about how you want to start off in your magical practice and how you want to take it forward. So one of the first mistakes I wanted to talk about, which I did, was committing to a particular magical system or approach too early on into your journey. So in the past, I thought that I had to commit fully to one approach, not look at any others. However, often I would go far down one route and realise it wasn't for me, and then I feel like I'd failed in some way, when really what had happened was that a particular system, I'd found out that it just didn't resonate with me. And what I'd sort of started off believing is that I had to figure it all out and get myself settled in a certain magical practice. However, I realised that that was just not helpful, and also, what's the rush really? But I think that's just me generally. I have a strong sense of wanting to belong, and that would include, I guess, belonging to a certain magical practice and also a spiritual practice, finding a path in that sense. And so it was no different when I was trying to figure out the path I was going to take magically. But what I would recommend and what I found beneficial after going down that mistaken path was that being open-minded and allowing yourself to practice, allowing yourself to explore systems and approaches to magic that you feel drawn to, and just see what you think. Don't feel you have to commit to one too early. And I found it far more enjoyable to just go with what my sort of felt sense was telling me, whether something excited me inside rather than intellectually thinking that I should do it. I think maybe sometimes it's about trusting your intuition and your felt sense of what draws you, and then going with that, and don't feel you have to stick to that. If you find that that magical approach isn't for you, look for something else. The next mistake that I made was relying solely on magic and forgetting about effort in the mundane world. So I think sometimes people get into magic because they think it will be a shortcut to solving their problems, and magic can increase the chances of you achieving your desired result in whatever that is. But in my opinion, we need to play our part in the mundane world too. So for example, I performed a ritual a few months ago now to increase my confidence in my job, because I was relatively new in the job and I was feeling a bit unsure of my place in the job. I was worried about making mistakes and things like that. So I wanted to build my confidence. But as well as the ritual, I knew that I also needed to step outside my comfort zone at work and do things that I didn't necessarily feel comfortable in, because otherwise I was always going to stay in my comfort zone. And over the coming weeks from doing that ritual, I believe that the magic put opportunities in front of me where I had to step out of my comfort zone. It was almost like I had no choice. And at those times, I felt really afraid, actually. I felt really fearful that I was going to muck things up, but I just had to do them. I could have chosen to avoid or try and get out of them, but I had to do my part in that as well. The magic put those opportunities in front of me, and I had to step forward and take those opportunities. And it all worked out. Over time my confidence has been building gradually, and I'm really grateful for that. Whatever your goal is or whatever outcome you would like, and by all means perform your magic for that, but think about how you can also increase the chances of that happening by what you do in the mundane world, because we're asking whoever you feel you're asking for that magic to come from, they can't do it on their own, and I believe that they expect us to do our bit as well. The next mistake that I made, which I think is it's probably an easy thing to do when you're first starting out, and that's listening too much to other people in the magical space, the magical community, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to listen to other people, because that's how we learn and that's how we grow and get inspiration from. But I think there comes a point where we need to think for ourselves and take responsibility for what we want to do. It's easy to get sucked into people who maybe look the part aesthetically, but maybe underneath they're not really who we would aspire to be. And I guess over time, the more people perhaps that we come across and that we watch on YouTube, or we read their writing, read their books, we get a feel perhaps of who they are and how credible they are. The way I kind of discern who I listen to is that if someone talks in absolutes, so if they say you must do this or you cannot do this because X, Y, Z, or they gatekeep then that tends to turn me off. I think if anyone talks in those kind of extremes, that's a warning sign for me, because there's a lot of grey areas. I don't think magic is an either or. There's lots of room in between, and we are all individuals. We all practice differently. Our magical results will likely be different. Maybe there'll be some similarities and overlaps, but I don't think any one person has the monopoly on magic and the way it works. So by all means, take inspiration from those people who are already in the space. But ultimately, I think it comes down to us taking responsibility for our own practice and deciding on what we want to do, and trying not to get limited just because people are placing their own standards on what other people should and shouldn't do when it comes to magic. The next mistake I made is reading too much. So I love a good occult book, I love a good magical practice book, but I think there comes a point where it's time to put down the books and actually do the practice. And I think that's what I was doing, was reading lots and maybe hoping that somehow through osmosis of reading that I would just get it. There were things that held me back from practicing magic. I didn't necessarily believe I was somebody who could practice magic, that I didn't have that particular talent. In the end, I just had to do it and be prepared to make mistakes, get things wrong, for the magic to be messy, and see how it went. And I'm so glad I did, because the results that I've got from a lot of the things that I've done have reinforced my belief in magic, but also they've changed my beliefs about myself, about certain things in the world that I believed in, and how I go about living my life. The next beginner mistake is trying to do too much at once. So I don't know if it's to do with my zodiac sign, as I'm an Aries, sun and ascendant. So I have a tendency to dive into things with both feet, fully immerse myself in them. I love it, but if I'm honest, I can become quite obsessive to the exclusion of all other things. And the problem is this can lead to exhaustion for me personally. And at times I think I've got near to burnout. It's so addictive for me to just dive in and immerse myself. I enjoy that process, and I still have to rein myself in because I do seem to be predisposed to that. But I'm much better at checking what I'm doing now and taking a step back and seeing if I need to slow down. It's tempting to want to do lots, especially if it's something you're interested in and passionate about. But perhaps I would recommend start off with one or two things you want to experiment with or read up on and see how you get on. Trying to do or learn too much at once can often lead to confusion, mental exhaustion, and the problem is that you might get so overwhelmed that you give up altogether. So take your time with it. It's about not trying to cram as much in as you can in a short space of time, but really being able to give yourself the mental space to absorb the things that you're learning. So another beginner mistake is not keeping records. So you might not need to keep records of your magical practice at the beginning, especially if you're just sort of starting out and experimenting. I don't think you necessarily need to get sort of that serious that early on, but I know that a lot of people keep, they call them grimoires or books of shadows, and it sort of tracks the magic that you've performed or the rituals you performed and your results, making notes of details like the time of day you did it. Some people, I think, track the lunar cycles and the planetary day that they did the magic on. And like I say, I don't necessarily think you need to go this deep too early on, but if you were building up to performing a particular ritual, it can be a good idea to document those sorts of things, because if the magic works, then you can look back and see what you did and maybe try and get those things set up similarly next time. But equally, if the magic doesn't work, or maybe it doesn't work to the extent that you wanted it to, maybe there were things you could tweak about when you did the ritual, what time or what day, what materials you used, that sort of thing. So it's a good way to keep a track of your experiments, if you like. Another beginner tip is when you skip the foundational elements of magic. So it might be tempting to jump in and go for the more advanced spells and rituals or magical practices, but I think there are skills that it's helpful to practice first. So these sort of include things like learning to ground and center yourself, learning how to manipulate energy. And there's a couple of books that are really good for this. You may have heard of Matt Oren's Psychic Witch and also Damien Eccles' High Magic. I'll link to those books in the description. I found those really helpful for learning about grounding and centering and how to sort of draw in energy and direct it. And there is also another practice that I would say is vital when it comes to magical work, particularly as a beginner. And it's one that people maybe often overlook or dismiss because they don't understand how much it links with magical practice. So if you want to find out more about what that is, there's a link to a video on the screen now and you can check that out. Thank you so much for being here and for watching, and I will see you soon.